All right, great. So that is now being live streamed, and I wanted to get started with our the video introduction of the World Affairs Council. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. Please use the chat function throughout the presentation to put in any questions that you may have for Stephanie, and we will do our best to answer them throughout the Q&A portion. You can also do the raise hand function if you need to. And now I would like to turn it over to David to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is International Women's Month, and our presenter in honor of International Women's Month is Stephanie Foster, who joins us today. Stephanie is the author of a well-sourced and important workbook and toolkit that's entitled Take Action, Fighting for Women and Girls, which covers the basics of activism and advocacy and gives the reader specific information about 4 issues related to girls, women, and gender equality, specifically the power and importance of education, expanding economic opportunities, eliminating gender-based violence, and participating in politics and public life. The book helps would-be activists start their work and stay focused and goal-oriented. Stephanie has deep and broad experience in women's economic and political empowerment, with decades of experience on Capitol Hill, the nonprofit sector, the law, and in the executive branch, including the State Department, with which she has a current affiliation. She has been fighting for women and girls her entire career, empowering women in Afghan war zones, monitoring elections in Ukraine, representing the US State Department in meetings with government and civil society leaders, and serving as a chief of staff in the US Senate. Having traveled, lived, or worked in over 100 countries, she has consistently used her voice and actions to change discriminatory laws and policies to help shift cultural norms and inequalities. She is a founding partner of SMASH Strategies, which provides strategic advice to corporations, institutions, and philanthropists to ensure that their investments in women and girls are effective and transformational. We welcome Stephanie to speak to us this afternoon. Stephanie.
Well, thank you so much, David, for the introduction. And thank you, of course, to the World Affairs Council for hosting me today. I'm very happy to be with you to talk about the book, but also really to talk about the critical importance of gender equality and equity across the globe. As we know, it's not just the right thing to do, but as I'll talk about in a bit, it obviously also has tremendous positive impacts on policy and outcomes for everyone, not just for women and girls. So I thought I would do 2 things in my remarks, and I do hope that you ask me a lot of questions about these issues. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, what the impetus for this was. And then secondly, to really talk about some of the, again, positive impacts when women and girls are more engaged, are meaningfully participating in the economy and society writ large. So with that, I want to start by talking about the book, which I jokingly say was my COVID project, and it was. But I was really noticing, as I've done work on behalf of, corporations, nonprofits, and then in the State Department and in my interactions with people just broadly, is I often was getting asked by people, women, but men as well, about what they could do to have a positive impact on issues that they saw in terms of gender inequality or other kinds of inequalities. And my sense is, and I don't think this is, a shocking revelation, but there is a tremendous amount of interest right now in trying to make positive change. Again, whether that's around gender issues, racial issues, LGBT issues, issues around class and poverty. And we see that really, I think, just across the board in the United States and globally as well. So my sense was from the conversations I was having, particularly with, young women, but again, young women and men, and really people of all ages, that there was a hunger for really thinking about how to be strategic and take on these very big issues. I'm reminded I was at a conference, or I was at the climate summit in Glasgow, and I moderated a panel there with young people. And one of the things they talked about was this sense of climate anxiety. And I think it goes a little bit to the issues around inequality as well, feeling like there's just these problems are very large and insurmountable, and sort of the anxiety that comes with not being able to address them in a way that people feel is, impactful or as impactful as they'd like. And that was really the impetus for putting together the book, which was giving a sense of advocacy tools, really trying to be very concrete about the kind of steps that anyone can take to be an advocate at any level, whether it's at an individual level or a community level, working with organizations, how to consider what organizations you might want to work with, how to think about narrowing your issue so that there's an understanding of by those you're trying to advocate to of what you're actually looking for. So really focusing on advocacy steps, providing resources for people, and that includes things like books and TV and movies and podcasts around these issues, because as we know, different people take in information differently. Some people like to read things, some people like to hear them, watch them, and there are great resources out there that people can use to really move forward their advocacy. So the book has resources around each of the 4 issue areas, and then role models. I think very important in this advocacy work generally to make sure that people understand that there have been people who've come before all of us who've done tremendous advocacy on every issue. And often I think we collectively forget that. I do myself, and actually in writing the book, I learned a lot about some women role models I really hadn't focused on in the past. But I think it's important, especially as we do celebrate Women's History Month, which is this month, to really help people see the stories that have come before and understand that the work that we all do, or that is done to focus on all these various issues, is really built on work that's been done by many, many people before us. Whether that are those people are civil rights activists, women who've run for office when they were the only one or virtually the only one, women who've started businesses. Madam C.J. Walker is one of the role models in the book. There was a TV series about her, so many people know about her, but she started a hair care products business and was the first woman millionaire in the United States. She's a Black woman. We don't often know about women like that until there's a TV series or a book, but I think it's important in advocacy to understand that there are people who've come before and lessons we can learn. So that was really the impetus for the book. And I think I would say, interestingly to me, that I've had a really good response from just very varying groups of people who have read the book or interested in advocacy. Everyone from groups like you all to a group we're later today actually going to be speaking to a group of young teenagers and young women and men here in the District of Columbia and the DC area who are focused on advocacy very locally in DC. So I think there's great interest in, again, being an advocate, and also great interest in trying to think about being as strategic as possible in that advocacy. So as I was, again, writing the book, took my experiences, and as mentioned, I've practiced law, I've been a chief of staff in the Senate, I've worked at NGOs and worked at the State Department. And when I'm asked about my career, I often say, I think the thing that ties together everything I've done is advocacy, whether it's legal advocacy or issue advocacy or advocacy within a bureaucracy. They're all different, but they're all advocacy. And the goal of figuring out what your goal is in terms of policy or program and figuring out a way to get there that's the most strategic. It's not always linear, but being strategic doesn't always mean that you're linear. So, that's really what I have seen in my own career. And so really pulling that together for this book. And as was mentioned, I thought about the issues that are the most important in my mind for addressing, inequalities for women and girls, and the ones where if change is made, there can be the biggest impact. And those are the 4 issues I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I do want to say this framework of advocacy really can be used for any issue, because it's really more about asking questions to drive change, coming up with a plan, having a very clear idea of what you want to accomplish, and then setting forward your steps to do that. So again, I focus on 4 issues, but they're not the only issues that certainly can be, should be or can be addressed when people are thinking about addressing inequality. It's really a guide and a roadmap for people in general who are thinking about advocacy and want to make a difference. So as mentioned, I do focus on 4 issues, and I briefly want to talk about the impact that they have on positive outcomes broadly. And I think it's important to say that these are issues, that I'm discussing that have to do with advocacy for women and girls. But I always want to say this isn't only because it makes life better for women and girls, but it's because it actually drives change and has a positive impact on communities writ large. So just kind of starting with that issue, one of the most prominent issues that I think many people focus on is the role of education and girls' education. We know that for every year that a girl or a young woman goes to school, continues in school, she has much more positive outcomes personally. And then, of course, for her family, she tends to marry later, she spaces her children more, she has the ability to get a job that pays more, and is often also much more involved in her community. We see that especially as young women engage and go to secondary school. There does tend to be, has been a real evening out of access to primary school for boys and girls around the world, which is great. That wasn't true, say, 25 years ago. So now, for the most part, boys and girls go to school in the same numbers. It's really when you get to secondary school that girls' participation tends to drop off. So as we all know, also secondary school is critical for critical thinking skills and the analytic life skills that you need to really succeed. So again, for every year that a girl goes to school, we see that there are positive outcomes. The other thing the book does, for example, in that case, is really look at things that can work to keep girls in school and that have worked around the world. And those are things like ensuring that we're looking at things like, are schools safe for girls? Because we know that sexual assault and sexual harassment does occur at school, and it does deter young women and girls from going to school. Looking at things like, are there, say, conditional cash transfers or payments that can be made to families to encourage them to keep girls in school? And that has worked. Because we've seen around the world that often when a family has a choice to make about whether they send a boy or a girl to school, in many countries, not all, they choose to send the boy to school. So looking at conditional cash transfers of payments to families can make a difference. Looking at how far schools are from where young women live, the closer the school is to their home, the more likely they are to continue their education. So the book outlines things like that in each of the 4 areas that can really make a difference. And, just to say, obviously it's the right thing to do to keep girls in school, but we also know it has a tremendous positive economic impact. And the statistic I like to use often is that in India, if 1% more girls went to school, their GDP would rise by over $6 $5 billion. So these are things that really have a positive impact on communities. And it's important to really keep that in mind as advocates. I think we often are advocates because we believe strongly in an issue, and the rights-based approach is critically important, but also thinking about what other arguments we can use to push forward an issue that might bring in people who are maybe skeptical or just not as focused on the issue as we all are as advocates. The second big issue is really economic empowerment. As was mentioned, this is obviously a critical issue that we see around the world. There have been many, many studies that show that if men and women were engaged in the workforce at equal numbers in every country, that is, equal numbers of men and women or equal percentages of men and women in the labor force, that global GDP would rise at least by, $12 trillion, which is quite large, of course, and is equal to, the GDP of large economies. So I think that's a focus for really making the case about the importance of ending discriminatory laws that keep women out of the workforce. And there are still many of those. The World Bank does a report every other year about called Women, Business, and the Law, that catalogs the laws around the world that are discriminatory. And that's everything from access to credit to access to job categories to whether or not there are laws against gender-based violence. It's about 30 or 40 laws that are types of laws that are analyzed for each country. And what we see is that this last report, about 190 countries, there were reports on 190 countries. I think 6 had achieved legal parity, legal equality between men and women, which is not a lot. But we also saw that there was a decrease in these discriminatory laws over time, but still today, 88 countries prevent women from specific job categories. So there's a law saying a woman can't be a truck driver or can't work in construction or can't have a certain kind of job. And obviously that has an impact on the earning capacity of families. In 15 countries, husbands can still stop their wives from working. So there are many of these kind of issues that the Women, Business, and the Law report chronicles, including something that maybe some people think seems really great, which is that in some countries women are forced to retire at an earlier age than men. But on the other hand, that has a negative impact on their retirement income and ability to support themselves as they get older. And as we all know around the world, women live longer than men. So retiring earlier actually can drive women into poverty. So I think looking at those issues around the economy, it's really the gamut from labor force participation to studies that show that as women participate on corporate boards, that companies tend to do better, that companies that have more women on corporate boards tend to also have more women in senior levels of management at the CEO and C-suite level. And in fact, we've seen that California has been a leader in really mandating that companies that have a certain amount, that are at a certain income level, have to have, I think, 3 or more women on boards. And so that's really happening now, kind of in real time. And I think that will give a lot more data to actually look at the impact of women at those leadership levels in corporations. The third thing I would talk about a little is women in politics. I did work for Senator Barbara Mikulski, who was, when she retired a few years ago, the longest serving woman in Congress, having been elected to the House and then the Senate. She, when elected to the Senate, was one of only 2 women in the Senate. She was the lone Democratic woman, and Nancy Kassebaum from Kansas was the lone Republican woman. Then we had 5 women in the Year of the Woman in 1992. And I started working for her right around that time. And then today there are 24 women senators of both parties. So I think we've seen a tremendous change even in our own country in a relatively short period of time. But we know that across the globe, we still need to ensure there are more women in decision-making positions. And it's also, I think, important to say why. Representation matters. Look, it matters that women and young girls and men and boys see that women can do, can be political leaders or can do any particular job. And in fact, the research shows that when boys see women in jobs that we might consider non-traditional, it does change the way that they think about what boys and girls can do as they grow up. So certainly it's important, just the whole idea of if you see it, you can be it, and encouraging people to be able to, use their skills in the way that they should. But I think the other thing we see is that women tend to, the studies show, they tend to be more responsive to their constituents. These are studies in the US. Studies across the globe show they tend to raise different issues. And they tend to advocate for issues in a different way. These things are everything from increased spending on education in a particular study that was done to focus on sanitation in India, where that is a particularly big issue, but women really raised that issue. And I think it's important to say that whatever the issue that's being considered, we know that often women bring different perspectives, and as do diverse groups of people. And so one thing that I do talk a little bit about in the book, but I think is important to highlight, and this is a good place for it, is that, we want to make sure, I think, as policymakers, that we are listening to the most diverse and inclusive groups of people possible. And that's, men and women, people of different ages, different ethnic groups, all the different ways that we think about and sort of categorize ourselves. And I think one of the good news things in the last several years is really an emphasis on what's called intersectionality, a word that many of you have probably heard or not, but it's the idea that, we all have different, we all bring different sort of life perspectives and identities to the world, and we need to make sure that our policy reflects those perspectives. And so it really argues, I think, for more inclusive and democratic decision-making. Just as a sort of an aside on that, I think it's always important to say that we also know that there's a linkage between women's education and politics, that women who serve as student body presidents of their universities are much more likely to go on and run for office. So that's an important thing to note, that as we encourage young women's participation at one level, it has an impact in their participation at another level. The last issue that I focus on is gender-based violence. And I would say, obviously this is really a horrible scourge, obviously. And it exists around the world. It is not just in places, we often hear people say, well, it's in places where people are poor or less developed countries, which really is not the case. The statistics show that it's true globally that gender-based violence is certainly a huge issue. We know there have been great efforts to impact gender-based violence. And actually, I think today President Biden is signing the Violence Against Women Act, the reauthorization of it into law again. After a lapse, we didn't have the VAWA Act, as it's called, for several years, but it has been reauthorized, and I believe he's signing it maybe as we speak, but certainly later today. The gender-based violence issues are huge because obviously they are a rights-based issue. Everyone has the right to live their lives free from violence, but also they do have a tremendous impact on communities, on individual families, and economically. And so really, again, making that linkage to businesses and making sure that businesses understand the impact that gender-based violence can have, and putting into place mechanisms to allow employees to get the help that they need, whether it's at the workplace or in their communities. So I think those are the broad set of issues that I talked about. The last thing I want to say is that obviously all of this is true, and then COVID happened, which we pretty much shut down 2 years ago this week, which is hard to imagine that it's been 2 years, but it has. COVID, I think, is something where we often have talked about or are talking about the gender disparities in real time. And I think while I don't wish we had the COVID pandemic, I do think it's helpful that people are focused on what has been the gender differential impact in real time, and not 5 years from now, and not, you know, as people do numerous PhD dissertations, which I'm sure they'll do on this. But I do think at least raising these issues, perhaps not addressing them in the most appropriate way, or effective way, but I think we're now talking about them. And just to put a point on it, we know that across the globe, women make up about 39% of the global workforce. We also know that of job losses that occurred during COVID, about 55% of those were borne by women. So there was women lost their jobs more often. That's likely because they were in the retail sector, hospitality sector. A lot of those jobs kind of went on hiatus. So that happened. Also, there was a tremendous, push, obviously, for education at home. A lot of women ended up having responsibility at the same time for essentially homeschooling their kids, which created a lot of, drag on the economy as well, in terms of women leaving their jobs because they just couldn't do everything they needed to do. And we already are in a society where there's women do much more care work than men. So we also saw increases in calls to domestic violence hotlines. Again, there's a lot of thought about that's because often, when you leave home to go to work, if you're in an abusive relationship, you're leaving your abuser. When you're at home all the time, obviously not so much. So it's maybe not that surprising. There's been an increase in domestic violence reporting throughout the COVID pandemic. So, I think while the pandemic has made things like this possible, where, we're all talking and we can do things via Zoom, and there's the ability that some people have to telework, the reality is that's not true for really most people around the world. And so the gender impact of COVID has been tremendous. I think there's a lot of question and concern about what we're really doing to address those issues, particularly around the care issues that are really preeminent and have really been exacerbated through this pandemic. But I do think at least we are talking about them in a very different way. And I think that's very positive. So I want to end with that in terms of this part of the conversation, just to say, I think obviously the book is something I did because I really was passionate about it, had some extra time during COVID. But I do think the most important lesson that I hope people take away from this is that in every sphere, we know that it's important to ensure that women are meaningfully able to participate. We have a tremendous number of issues around the world, as we know, even before COVID, even before everything that's going on today. And we really hobble ourselves in our ability to meet those challenges if we don't use all the talent that we have. And that's obviously, I'm talking about this in terms of gender, but that also goes to other people who feel they're not able to participate because of their age, their race, their gender identity. I mean, there are lots of ways that people feel often excluded. And I think one of the lessons is that we really can't afford to do that. And we need to think about ways to ensure that people feel included and that they are able to, through advocacy and other ways to make their voices known, are able to make a difference in their lives and the lives of their communities. So with that, I'm going to stop for a minute and happy to answer the questions and have a conversation.
Thanks so much. Please continue to put your questions into the chat so we can get those answered. I'm going to pass it over to Saul to give us an update on upcoming programs.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, I'm Saul Lash. I'm president of the World Affairs Council here in Reading, and we do think we have some very exciting upcoming programs. Touching a bit on your topic given today, April 13 is our next program, The Immigration Crisis in Europe, the Case of Spain, with Laura Lopez Calogna. She is a visiting instructor of Spanish presently at Albright College, and we look forward to what she has to share. I suspect she'll be able to also touch on the whole topic of the Ukraine immigration refugee crisis. Then a week later, April 20, Richard Fontaine. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. And he will be speaking to us on the current state of relations between China and Taiwan. I think we're all aware that with this crisis in the Ukraine, there's a quick spillover. Sometimes we're very worried about that. At any rate, he'll be focusing specifically on that. For us here at the World Affairs Council, it was March, Stephanie Foster, in March of 22 years ago when we had our last live session. And I'll reference that in just a second. Well, let me do that now. Our speaker then was from the War College in Rhode Island, Naval War College. And one of her topics, she spoke on women's issues, and she made a point, maybe you'll address this for us in a minute after I finish here, where women are in senior leadership positions around the world, those countries are less likely to engage in violence. And I think that's probably a true statement still. At any rate, folks, coming up May 5, we are going to have our first Back in Live luncheon program with Representative Christy Houlihan and Representative Dan Muser, two of whom sit on the Foreign Affairs Council, Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Representatives. They represent us locally. We'll have a panel discussion, moderated panel discussion. We think it's going to be very, very interesting. It'll be at the Doubletree downtown by Hilton. And take a look at that on our website. The cost for non-members is significantly higher than for members. Take a look at that and register. And we're also going to heavily subsidize students with corporate sponsorships for most of the cost for students, but they still have some skin in there as far as their attendance. We're looking at about 160 people, about 40 of whom, 1/4 were characterizing for students. So folks, take a look at that. Then finally, scheduled now in May, James Garrett, who is a young man graduating from Penn State University in May. He spent 2 weeks in the Middle East in November. He reported on that in our newsletter in January, under the aegis of the World Affairs Council of America. And his funding for that was for the country of Qatar, and that's where he was. And his topic will be Qatar, its emerging role in the Middle East. We think you'll find that interesting also, folks. And that's where we are presently scheduled. We are working on a program also for June, one that might be focused in Germany, and we'll see about that. Okay, Amanda.
Thank you so much. In terms of questions, one of the things as you were discussing the different aspects affecting women across the world that came to mind for me particularly were health issues. Can you talk a little bit more about access to like when girls are menstruating and, you know, healthcare and childbirth, how all of those issues really affect women and girls throughout the world?
Yes, and let me first just respond, though. I'll respond to the comment about your speaker 2 years ago, Joan Johnson Fries, who's a friend of mine, actually, and has written a lot about women in peace and security. And I think what we do see, and this actually will then finally get me to the health issue, is that when in countries where there are, you know, higher numbers of women in leadership, again, whether that's in the executive branch, at the ministerial level, or in parliaments, we do see that those countries do tend to be more prosperous and less prone to conflict. And I think that's something that's undergirded a lot of the work and research on the women, peace, and security agenda, which I'm happy to talk about a little bit more later, because that is really a way for us to think about, again, these issues, not just on an individual level, but how they impact not just our countries, actually, but globally, trying to develop and build on more sort of inclusive societies. I think the other thing that having more women in these positions means is that they bring different perspectives to public policy issues, and healthcare is a good example of that. On the COVID issue, which I'll just touch on briefly, we saw that when the first COVID task force was established in the previous administration, there were no women on it, basically. And, you know, so when the new task force was established, there were many more women. And the reason that's important is that, you know, as I said earlier, obviously COVID has had a disproportionate impact on women, and needing to understand it both in terms of employment, but also are there differential health outcomes? That's really, really critical. On the health issues generally, one of the things I talk about in the book that I think kind of really frames this issue is that, you know, in the US until the 1990s, NIH, which is a prominent and preeminent institution in the world, testing, you know, drugs and interventions, medical devices, was basically only testing them on men. And that was even, you know, those were even, you know, drugs and pharmaceuticals that women would basically mostly be using. My Senator Mikulski, who was my boss at that time, and bipartisan groups, it was Senator Olympia Snowe, a Republican from Maine, Senator Mikulski from Maryland, Connie Morella from Maryland, and I think it was Nita Lowey from New York, really raised the issue of NIH doing this kind of testing only on men. And that did change. The reason I raise it in the context of health is then we did find out that certain things, actually, certain interventions, certain drugs were more effective on men than women. There were racial differences. So I think even when we're thinking about something that, when I wake up in the morning, if I have to take, you know, a prescription, I don't necessarily think about, is it, you know, has this prescription been tested in a way that ensures that it helps me in the maximum way? Just to say, we were not really doing that until the last 30 years. So in the healthcare industry in general, that was a big issue in terms of the testing and differential impacts that were found. And then, you know, when we look at what's going on for many women around the world, obviously healthcare is a tremendous issue. Having access to the full range of healthcare services is often difficult, and to even preventive services is often difficult, given where people live and the fact that there aren't sometimes doctors or nurses or healthcare professionals able to do that. So I think there's been a lot of advocacy around those issues globally. And that's, you know, every issue from things like, as you're saying, access to, you know, in childbirth, access to good OBGYN services, or whether it's access to, you know, malaria prevention programs. There has been a lot of funding kind of focused on those issues. I think the challenge is ensuring that as those funds are going to those issues, whether they're from governments or large foundations, that there are people charged with looking at the gender impact and ensuring that there is equitable access for men and women. Because, you know, I think it's easy for people to do the work the way they've done it and not always ask those questions. And as I always say, if you ask the question and the answer is there is no difference, like you look at the data and you say, oh my gosh, men and women do have equal access to this service or this program or to running for office, that's great, then we know it. But I will say that more often than not, that is not the case. So as we're developing those kind of systems to provide healthcare, it's important to do that. It's also important, this is an unfortunate thing, you know, around the world, there is often sexual violence in conflict that gets utilized by actors to the conflict. And that's also important to address issues like that, so that there are health services that those survivors have. They're not all women and girls. It can also be men and boys. But I think, you know, looking at conflict and also trying to understand the health impacts there is also really important.
Thank you. We have a question from Bruce. In her recent book, Saving Us, Catherine Hayao speaks to the significant advantages women can add to even undeveloped economies. She cites clear examples of real value, providing appropriate education to girls, and the long-term rewards for this investment. She references Catherine Wilkinson's TED Talk, which explains that in many lower income societies, women are the primary farmers of the world. If the gaps in resources made available to them relative to what men can access are eliminated, farm yields rise by 20 to 30%. You already mentioned the vital role that women can play in the area of climate change. Could you elaborate further?
Sure, and those issues are very intertwined, climate and food security. So one other thing I'll say as kind of to frame it is that we also know that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change in a negative way. 80% of climate refugees are women and children. So women are more affected by climate change and disasters than men. But we also know that women can be drivers of change in terms of affecting climate change and addressing it. So countries where there are more women parliamentarians tend to enter into environmental treaties much at a higher rate than countries where there are not as many women parliamentarians. And on an individual basis, women tend to be much more open to, doing things on a daily basis that can mitigate climate change. So I think we need to see women as drivers of change there. And obviously climate is, has a dramatic impact on everyone's ability to farm and grow, crops that are needed for people to eat. And so climate change and food insecurity are really obviously quite interlinked. And as you said, women are the majority of smallholder farmers in the world, which means people who, farm a small plot, obviously, as opposed to either a large corporate farm or even larger community farms. And so there studies do show that really ensuring that women who are smallholder farmers having the right access to seeds and other things that they need to grow food, whether it's seeds or the implements they need that are actually more efficient, can have a tremendous impact. So I think looking at those kind of questions again is really important, and linking that to the ability to affect food security and climate. I know from other work that I've done that there are a lot of NGOs around the world that are working with fairly low tech solutions to these issues, so that we're not kind of building in a high-tech solution that may not be that accessible in some communities, given that they may not have as much access to electricity or other kinds of power. So there are NGOs that are doing very good work in terms of how they, ascertain what the needs are of farmers, but particularly women farmers, and try to meet those needs again in a more low-tech and sustainable way. So those are certainly issues that are important, critical issues for many places around the world, because obviously food is what we all need, and people do need to make sure that we as people do need to make sure that there's equitable access to the implements and seeds that people need to actually grow food to sustain themselves.
You mentioned briefly refugees, specifically refugees from climate issues, but as we're watching the war in Ukraine unfold and the 2 million refugees, mainly women and children, going throughout Europe, what does refugee policies in general, or what can states and non-state actors be doing to really make sure that refugee policies are taking care of the vulnerable, particularly women and children?
Yeah, I mean, these are very heart-wrenching issues, obviously. And the refugee issues are huge. I just watched President Zelensky's remarks to the US Congress, and if anyone hasn't done that this morning, I would recommend you do that, just to get a sense of, from his perspective, what's happening. There's a video embedded in his remarks that really shows the devastating impact on Ukraine of what's going on right now. So just to say, if you haven't watched it, please do. Look, refugee policy around the world is very, very challenging. There are many displaced people all over the world in places we don't often think about. There are, people who cross borders, so they're refugees, but then there are people who are internally displaced in their own countries. That's happening in Ukraine, but it's happening around the world in many other places. And so it's a global, it's a global issue. We know that often when people do end up in refugee camps, they stay not for months, but for years, for often a decade or more. So, addressing refugee policy is multi-layered. It has to do with the ability for people to go back if they, to their countries, the ability for people to make money while they are in refugee status, the ability for them to be integrated with their host communities. So there are just a wide range of issues that go on with refugee, with refugee policy, which is very complicated, but really important. And I think, one thing that I have seen that I think is also important to know is that people, in the US, we've had a lot of refugees recently from Afghanistan, which I can talk a little bit about later as I've worked on that issue. But, people have been very open and welcoming. So I think it's important to think about the refugee issue at every level, from the big issues, like the importance of, stopping conflict so there are no refugees, which that's one stream of refugees. Some refugees are because of climate. There are numerous reasons people leave their homes, but thinking about it at that level, all the way down to what people can do to help refugees who end up in their communities.
Thank you. Deborah, I see that you have your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? If not, I'm going to encourage you to put it into the chat. You mentioned Afghanistan. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in Afghanistan and what, if you know, conditions are like in that country now since the withdrawal of US troops last fall?
Sure. And I'll say, I'm going to talk, this is in my personal capacity, not the views of the US government. I do work at the State Department, but I'm not speaking on behalf of the State Department. I did work in Afghanistan at the US Embassy for about a year and a half in 2012 through 13, so about 10 years ago, and focused on women and civil society there. I was able at that time to travel around the country quite a bit and meet with women, women's groups, women entrepreneurs, women in public life, women in the media, civil society activists, and really, journalists learned a lot about what was going on there at that time, which was again 10 years ago. And then when I was back at the State Department in the Obama administration, one of the issues I did work on also was Afghanistan. So I've continued to follow Afghanistan for a while and now have gone back to the State Department as a senior advisor on women and girls to an office that focuses on relocation. It's called the Office of the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts. And so in that position, my job is to look at this pipeline of people who left Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul, who are still looking to leave Afghanistan, who were relocated either temporarily in third countries or then have come to the United States for resettlement, and really try to understand the differential issues that are faced by women and girls in that pipeline. And, it's a lot of issues that are around ensuring they have access to information, protection services, healthcare, things like that. There are a lot of things that go on that it's important to really ensure we're being focused on women and girls during that process. At the same time, Secretary of State Blinken also appointed a special envoy for Afghan women, girls, and human rights, Rina Amiri, and she really focuses on more of the work inside Afghanistan and with multilateral partners to focus on what's going on in the country. So, the reports, it's very hard to know exactly what's going on because, of course, the US Embassy is closed and we no longer operate in the country. So what we know is from media, social media, people having conversations with their family members and friends, and what other governments are hearing as well. So, I think, again, it's kind of what's in the news, which is not so good, right? That there's restrictions on freedom of movement. There's a great and grave humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. The World Health Organization, I believe, said a couple of months ago that I think between 5 and 10% of Afghans would have enough food through the winter. We're now through the winter almost, but that's a pretty shocking statistic. And humanitarian assistance is starting to flow into Afghanistan, not through the Taliban, but it's obviously a big issue. The other issue that people are watching right now goes to the issue in the book, which is girls' education. Afghan schools, for the most part, open next week in March, I think March 21st. And the question will be whether or not the Taliban allows girls and boys equal access to schools. And everyone is really watching that, urging the Taliban to ensure there's equal access. We do see that universities have opened. Some of them opened earlier this year, and there have been some young women who've gone back to university, not in the same numbers that were attending university before. So, you know, I think it's a very difficult situation. A lot of reporting about door-to-door searches and things like that. But again, it's all through kind of the sources that anybody on this call could, you know, can access, really, the media and social media reporting. And again, what we're hearing just from people who are talking to their friends and family and letting us know what they're hearing. And from NGOs who represent Afghan women and girls, they're also a great resource because they talk to a lot of people and then are able to say what they're hearing from people on the ground.
Great. Could you leave us with something positive? So what, throughout the world, what would you describe as like the model nations in terms of political equity or fairness for women and education? I'm sure there's different countries and different metrics, but I'm just curious who are kind of the gold star countries and who that even the US or other countries could emulate.
Well, I think here's the good news. I think there's tremendous appetite for this conversation to really be policy. I mean, I think that people know in a different way than I've seen, and I've worked on these issues for a long time, that we need to ensure that we are, you know, including diverse groups of people, women and men, and again, in every other kind of iteration in policymaking. I think people know that. The hardest thing is how to make that a reality. But I do think that that's something that we see a tremendous amount of interest in. There's so much that we can learn, the US, from other countries. And I think it's not always the countries that we think that we think we can learn from. And every iteration is slightly different. So for example, in terms of women's political participation, we know a couple of things. We know that really quotas tend to have an impact, you know, a law for a country or for a political party that says X number of seats in a particular body, Congress, Parliament, need to be women, or set-asides. We obviously don't have that. Countries that have quotas, you know, do tend to meet them, and they tend to be between 35% and 40% then of women in their parliaments. The country with the highest number of women in parliament is Rwanda, which often shocks people. Rwanda is a landlocked country in Africa, which had a horrible genocide, as you all probably know. And there's been a tremendous push there for gender equality, in part because many men were slaughtered in the genocide. And so there was a need to really figure out how to rebuild. And that was a decision that was made, was really to address gender equality issues. But having said that, you know, Rwanda is not the only country that's doing well on one indicator. There are other countries that have tremendously good indicators on the economy or on addressing gender-based violence. I think what we see is that there are pushes throughout, and on every issue, there are countries that are doing better. We, just on the political participation front, just so we all know this, we are 75th in the world on that list of ranking, despite the great gains that women have made from both political parties in terms of election to Congress. So we have a long way to go and a lot to learn. There's a lot we can learn about how to address online violence issues that have an impact on women in politics. There are countries that make that illegal and have really taken stronger steps on that. There's a lot we can learn on a foreign policy level, given this group. I maybe end with this, that About 7 years ago, Sweden became the first country to adopt a feminist foreign policy, which really means sort of centering foreign policy decisions on understanding the impact on women and girls, or a gendered impact, and ensuring that questions are asked in policymaking circles or in the policymaking apparatus to really ensure that our foreign policy, or the feminist foreign policy, understands the impacts and takes those into account. Since then, there have been about 7 countries that have adopted feminist foreign policies as their official foreign policy. And it's a diverse group of countries: France, Spain, Mexico, Luxembourg, Libya recently, and I think Germany, just with its new government. The good news is there is quite a movement in the United States pushing feminist foreign policy. I've written on it quite a bit, actually, as well as many others, and globally. So an idea of really transforming foreign policy to really be more people-centered, or centered on understanding the impacts on people, not just a policy that is, it is looking at the bilateral, relationships between countries, which is obviously still critically important, but trying to really make sure that there's a gender focus as well, and a gender analysis as policy decisions are being made in the foreign policy and national security arena. There's much more to come on that. There's a lot of conversation. It's a very interesting topic. It has many, many layers. So I guess the hopeful note is that this is an evolving landscape where people are really, I think, looking at these issues in a really sophisticated way and trying to have an impact on every part of society, from people's daily lives to the large kind of policies that impact us all globally.
Thank you so much. Up on the screen, you'll see the cover of Take Action, Fighting for Women and Girls, Stephanie's new book. You can see a link in the chat to purchase the book on Amazon. I'm sure it's at local booksellers as well. I want to thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us today and for having this conversation. Anything you wanted to close out with, Paul?
Well, just thank you for having me. I really have enjoyed the conversation. I hope I can come up to one of your programs in person when you have them, and look forward to meeting all of you.
We would love that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like I got a little something in there, but I can't get rid of it.
Stephanie, can you stay with us just a bit after we sign off? I need to get some information from you.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. Take care.